I'm going to talk about experiments and avant-gardes in early modern history between the 1500s and the 1800s. So between the 13th and 17th centuries, increasing numbers of people across Europe engaged in two processes. One was a renaissance that would recover the knowledge enjoyed by the ancient Greek, Romans, and Arabs through translation, learning, and dissemination. And a second process concerned religion and the institutions by which it was organized and controlled. In the early 16th to early 18th centuries, Catholic and Protestant denominations thus contested Christian principles and practices. And that was exactly what empowered ordinary men and women. So one fascinating convergence of these cultural developments was the publication of Utopia by the English statesman and writer Thomas More in 1516. This became a publishing phenomenon. It was translated into national vernaculars across Europe and subsequently the world, and was used to justify critical and even revolutionary agendas with which More himself would have been uncomfortable. But Utopia also gave rise to the concept and language of utopianism, a term used to describe the capacity to transcend the circumstances and the power structures of one's immediate life in order to imagine ways of living based on idealistic principles. This capacity was not always regarded positively. To be styled utopian was as likely to be a criticism as a compliment in the early modern period. Utopianism, nevertheless, became an important feature of early modern and modern culture. Utopia, meaning no place in Greek, was an imaginary island whose customs and institutions were described through a fictional dialogue between a traveler and another character. Utopians could believe, according to More, in a god or gods of their choosing, so long as they did not try to harangue others into believing the same. But more importantly, in Utopia, there was no private property, no monetary system, or even the desire for material riches and possessions. Householders actually lived communally and regarded gold and jewels as irrelevant. Although More was a Catholic, Utopia appeared to offer plenty of insights into what a reformed Protestant polity might look like. For example, its commitment to enlightened political counsel, its prioritization of the common happiness, and its lauding of the participatory nature of political structures. Even though contemporary commentators often use the label utopianism to belittle certain political positions, Utopia proliferated across Europe with the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, and it led to multiple radical religious groups and sects. So religious groups offered opportunities to experiment with new ideals and practices regarding gender, class, and sexuality. Congregations such as Baptists, Levelers, Quakers, Methodists, they often offered new opportunities for spiritual equality, counting a high number of women, and sometimes allowing them to speak in church or even preach. The shoemaker George Fox, as the founder of the biggest dissenter church in England in the mid-17th century, the Quakers, or the Society of Friends, asserted, for example, women's rights to preach and predict, transgressing conventional gender boundaries. Some women became leaders of spiritual sects, like Antoinette Bourignon, in the 17th century. She was raised as a Catholic in the southern Netherlands, and she called herself the mother of true Christians, employing for herself the image of the woman as the empty vessel, the unlearned virgin, and the spiritual mother as a weapon to gain spiritual leadership over a group of mainly male followers. Another group called the Labadists, meaning the followers of Jean de Labadie, a French pietist who had originally been a Roman Catholic Jesuit priest. This is a group that is an interesting case in point. In 1675, they founded a religious community in the Netherlands, oriented around principles of gender equality and holiness. All property was communal, and sartorial rules were meant to emphasize simplicity. Again, gender is very important here. Female converts included the Dutch poet, scholar, and author Anna Maria van Schoorman, who is known as the learned and most noble virgin of Utrecht. Van Schoorman was the first woman to study at a Dutch university in 1636. Actually, she attended lectures in a curtained booth so that male students could not see her. But what all this shows is that radical religious groups offered women ways to transgress the limitations that conventional religion and patriarchal society had imposed on them. At the same time, these sects also experimented with other forms of equality, notably class. Now, the irony in all this is that Thomas More would have actually preferred to keep utopia away from the masses. But his own terminology was now appropriated to describe these experiments, experiments in worshipping, experiments in living, and experiments in loving. In fact, what materialized was his worst fear, namely that readers would take the irony that permeates his work literally and use his text as a justification for radical ideas. Translation of utopia in different languages, in fact, even coincided with moments of political crisis and, on occasion, revolutionary opportunity. Now, the existing boundaries of religious and moral acceptability were definitely crossed by the French aristocrat and libertine Marquis de Sade. Sade produced numerous novels, the most infamous being the pornographic The 120 Days of Sodom or The School of Libertinage, 1785, as well as plays and pamphlets, many of which actually have been burned or lost because of their scandalous content. Marquis de Sade spent 32 years of his life in various prisons and an insane asylum as a result of this work. Sade's thought was anchored in individual sexual, religious, and political freedom. He pushed liberty to its extreme, arguing for the freedom to even rape or kill, demonstrating a kind of moral skepticism and political relativism. Sade has been often regarded both as a cruel, cynical, misogynistic figure, but also as an advocate of religious, political, and sexual freedom. This author underlined individualism and bodily desire, even critiquing the Enlightenment's focus on reason to battle religion and superstition. So on the one hand, Sade's radical atheism and individualism, as well as his plea for violent sexuality, could not be further from the 17th century radical religious sects that emphasized true Christianity, moral decency, or indeed the mode of civil and communal living espoused by utopians. More's utopia, the concomitant notion of utopianism, the religious upheaval in early modern Europe, they all sparked opportunities to imagine a different society. On the other hand, both SAD and the religious sects that were mentioned show how gender, sexuality, religion, class, and politics are inextricably connected in utopian radical thought, offering new ways to envision society, but also transgressive modes of living in practice. So now I'm going to talk about experiments and avant-gardes in modern history in the 19th century. So the social and economic disruptions caused by the development of capitalism and industrialization in 19th century Europe sparked a wave of utopian ideas and experiments that aimed at imagining and practicing a different world. Most of these utopias were based on ideas of solidarity and egalitarianism, and they addressed rising inequality in rapidly industrializing European societies. The French mathematician and social reformer Hollande Rodriguez was the first who used the term avant-garde in the year 1825. Actually, he conceived the artist as an agent of change in opposition to dominant bourgeois norms and values. Radical ideas formulated by thinkers like Saint-Simon or the British social reformer Robert Owen, the French philosopher Charles Fourier, they all inspired the founding of communes and cooperatives in Europe and the rest of the world. One interesting example is the Guise Familistère, which was a utopian community founded in 1859 by French industrialist Jean-Baptiste André Gaudin. So that was supposed to be a community with a communal sense of living, with the abolition of property and so on. Now, the ideas of Saint-Simon and Fourier also had an important influence on the French Revolution of 1848, and even more so, the Paris Commune of 1871, which was the short-lived revolutionary government that seized power in the French capital following the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. This was arguably the most famous and influential utopian political experiment of the 19th century. The Commune drew up an ambitious program. It was a program of socialist self-rule based on collaboration and cooperation. And it included measures such as free education, the nationalization of church property, and the liberalization of marriage laws. Although it was crushed after 2 months, and while its existence actually only saw a few of its plans implemented, it really became an important inspiration for social and socialist movements around the world. An interesting element about the Commune has to do with the connection between politics and arts. So during the Commune, the Federation of Artists was established to support young artists and unorthodox artistic styles. In fact, the military origins of the term avant-garde, meaning actually it's a reference to a small group of soldiers who scout out or explore an area in order to get information about the enemy. So this term placed artists in the same category as revolutionaries on the barricades. The French painter Gustave Courbet, for example, who took an active part in the Commune, believed that the artistic presentation of workers and peasants could truly help in their struggle for social advancement. Avant-garde artists, however, often saw as the primary mission to push artistic and aesthetic boundaries by continuously narrowing the meaning of art, thus giving birth to the concept of art for art's sake, in French, l'art pour l'art, and ultimately what we called abstraction. Succeeding generations of the French avant-garde rather focused on the aesthetic legacy of realism, while progressive painters and sculptors turned decisively apolitical. In fact, the last 4 decades of the 19th century showed a tendency towards abstraction. French painter Edouard Manet was one of the most important forerunners of abstraction. He focused on forms, colors, light, and composition. Then we have the Impressionists, named after the French painter Claude Monet, who focused on how the world appeared to them at a certain moment in time, focusing on the idea of impression. Accordingly, the Impressionists challenged the contemporary convention of naturalism or the naturalistic portrayal, and instead they prepared the way for a completely new concept of art, which was dominated by subjectivism, namely the personal perceptions, the personal emotions. A group of painters called Les Fauves, literally meaning the wild beasts, officially existing between 1905 and 1908, so beyond the strict boundaries of the 19th century, but very much affected by the late 19th century. They even further developed this idea of Impressionism. In fact, French painter Paul Cézanne reached a stage whereby his paintings became nearly grid-like compositions of elemental geometrical forms, circles, triangles, and cubes. The move towards a higher level of abstractions in fine arts, from realism to cubism later on in the 20th century, was in fact a reaction to certain social developments, also technological developments. For example, a reaction to new technology, most importantly photography, and was also connected to new ideas, new conceptions about the individuals, about individualism and the inner self. So realism and impressionism were the stages in the process of abstraction in the fine arts, but there were also stages in the process of literature too. So literary realism aimed to represent the totality of contemporary society by depicting the quotidian, ordinary lives of people of all classes. Realist writers embraced as well the growing importance of technology and science. French novelist Honoré de Balzac, he sought to emulate the scientific method of observation in his writings. Similarly, the British writer George Eliot defined realism as, quote, the doctrine that all truth and beauty are to be attained by a humble and faithful study of nature. French author Victor Hugo, British novelist Charles Dickens, these two were arguably the most influential writers of their time. They focused on the misery and squalor of the underclass in Paris and London. And then we have the naturalist authors, such as Émile Zola in France, or Anton Chekhov, the playwright in Russia. And they took this even further. Influenced by the theory of evolution formulated by the British biologist Charles Darwin, this tendency, what we call naturalism, sought to identify the underlying forces that shaped the actions of literary characters rather than just describing them truthfully. Then we have literary impressionism, which was a direct outgrowth of realism and naturalism. The aim of impressionism in literature was to observe and to represent the subject in as much detail as possible. But the main difference here is that the focus was increasingly becoming not anymore the material or the social world, but the subjective impressions and experiences of individuals. Major exponents of literary impressionism were Polish-British writer Joseph Conrad, French writer Marcel Proust. They both experimented with many formal innovations, such as stream of consciousness, nonlinear timeliness. Also, in their books, you have multiple narrators, but also a visual imagery. Now, very briefly, in the field of music, the most important innovator was undoubtedly German composer Richard Wagner. Wagner renewed the music genre, the operatic genre in particular, a genre that used to be dominated by popular Italian composers like Giuseppe Verdi. But Wagner's concepts revolutionized opera, the concept of what he called the total artwork, in German, the Gesamtkunstwerk. It attempted to free art from commercialization. Wagner advocated pure autonomous art, very much influenced by the ancient Greek idea. And in his understanding was manifested in his notion of Musikdrama, meaning a merging of different branches of art. Music, text, visuality, these were all fused. In his vision, even architecture, the architecture of opera houses was part of this. In fact, he was himself involved in the planning and the implementation of the venue of his own artworks, the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth, in Bavaria, in Germany. Now, Wagner introduced also the idea of the leitmotif, which is a recurring short musical phrase referring to characters, dramatic situations, or cultic objects. In terms of music, the highly avant-garde element that he introduced was atonality, which he experimented with in his work Tristan und Isolde from 1865, and then, of course, in later works. Now, Wagner had an important influence all over and across the board, but especially on the French composer Claude Debussy. Debussy was often seen as, in a way, a direct heir, but also someone who took this over and further. He's very often seen as the first impressionist composer, which typically was a label that he himself vigorously rejected. Impressionism in music focused on the subjective perspective of the artist, again, conveying the moods, the feelings. So again, the idea was to reject tradition and to emphasize the new innovative elements that had to do with unusual chord combination, unusual musical coloring, and things of this kind. Now, in many ways, the 19th century avant-garde artists and thinkers reacted to the profound changes that they experienced in their societies, from the growth of the industrial working class to the spread of photography, and even to the advent of the railroad or the telegraph. So science and the new technologies of observations, technologies of that had to do with speed, they all inspired them to focus on new perspectives, how to think about the world in its totality. Now, while the avant-garde often seemed to abandon socio-political engagement for the sake of innovation, what is again called art for art's sake, in reality, these still mirrored the waves of political and social transformation of their time. So again, all these transformations are embedded within these new art forms. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about experiments and avant-gardes in contemporary history during the 20th century. So the 20th century gave expression to a whole set of social, cultural, and political experiments in which the artistic and literary avant-garde played a pivotal role. The background for these artistic developments was the incredibly turbulent area around the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, which was a period marked by new inventions, innovations, explorations, a whole range of developments by scientists, engineers, researchers, and travelers. Science, once again, became a reference point for artistic life and vice versa. Many Russian avant-garde artists, for example, including Kazimir Malevich and Vasily Kandinsky, they believed that the process of creating art was similar to a series of experiments in physics or chemistry, and equal to them as a relevant way of acquiring knowledge about the world at large. Most famously, Kandinsky argued in 1910 for an art that would not rely on the material world, but rather on the expression of the artist's inner selves, an idea which very strongly impacted avant-gardist circles and can be regarded as one of the core ideas behind avant-garde in the 20th century. Now, in the Soviet Union, during the 1920s and 30s, several interesting experiments concerning avant-garde, very much the byproduct of the Bolshevik Revolution, can be observed. For example, several house communes which were built following the aesthetic program of constructivism and according to certain conceptions of egalitarianism, collectivism, and progressivism, again, with a very political character. At the same time, the German expressionists, they tried to influence and awaken the world through the expression of their own inner spiritual visions, trying to eliminate what they call the borders between art and living. Now, this concept, the elimination of the borders between art and living, was manifested in the clearest way in the artistic and architectural movements of constructivism, represented, for example, by the German Bauhaus school and the Russian state art and technical university called Vutemas. Intrinsic to the avant-gardist wish to create and renew for future life was a deconstructive approach. For instance, the technique of montage. It was a technique employed by several different tendencies and movements. It was employed by the Cubists, by the Dadaists, by the Surrealists, and it was based on a clash between forms, colors, textures, objects, images, turning actually the image in art from representation to presentation. So this further suggested a more participatory position for the spectator, and it identified artistic creation with daily social, urban, and political life. We have new artistic practices ranging from happenings to events to kinetic art, visual art, installations, and progressively new materials and techniques that multiplied. For the artistic avant-garde of the early 20th century, creating art was a form of social and political activity. the ethos of the avant-garde in Europe was often pitted against authoritarianism, and especially against bourgeois liberalism, making art a battlefield of ideas and experiments. In the 1920s, for example, the new Soviet regime tried to open up new ways of artistic avenues for the masses, giving space to artistic avant-gardist ambitions. This all changed in the 1930s, however, because Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, proclaimed the program of socialist realism for the arts, meaning that manifesting individual views via an individual artistic language was dangerous, and in fact could result in different forms of severe retribution that could even result to execution. Now, a similar tendency towards repression for an individual artistic expression, avant-gardistic expression, occurred in Germany after 1933 and Hitler's rise to power. So there we have the application of the label of degenerate art, entartete Kunst, to various avant-garde production. Again, the idea of art considered to be dangerous. Now, a rethinking and critique of the concept of modernity was a fundamental aspect of the relationship between art and politics and the avant-garde, especially during the interwar period. While very much a product of modernity themselves, the ideologically committed avant-gardists, they positioned themselves as harbingers of the destruction of traditional experience. They, for instance, opposed tradition to creative freedom which to them was the only way to project new life. And they sought to achieve and to bring their works into the real world through that formula. Now, French Cubism, German Expressionism, Russian Suprematism, Dutch De Stijl, Russian Constructivism, these were all movements, artistic movements, which emphasized the value of the individual artist and his or her activity in opposition to an empty, modern, industrial world that dehumanized. To them, art contributed or could contribute to the recovery of creative energies, which could employ technology, but which could also operate outside the technological, outside the industrial. As Vasily Kandinsky, the Russian artist, or Piet Mondrian, the Dutch painter, both believed, art should have a spiritual function. It could provide a de-individualized new image of the world. Then we have Surrealism, and Surrealism was partly inspired by Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis and the whole idea of the unconscious. And Surrealism also explored the territory of the unconscious as a means to go beyond the appearances of reality, to enter the realm of what surrealists called the marvelous, the ultimate meaning of reality. So art became an adventure of the soul, but also of the mind. A major figure in avant-gardism in the early 20th century was French-American artist Marcel Duchamp, someone who tried to free artistic creation from the aesthetic canon, from the aesthetic criterion, and to refocus it on intellectual activity. Now, After the Second World War, there was a new wave of avant-garde, often called the neo-avant-garde, which emerged in both Western and Eastern Europe, but also in the United States. Starting in France, there were two tendencies, the nouveau roman in literature and the nouveau réalisme in the arts. And these were both typical exponents of this neo-avant-garde of the late 50s and 60s, which was a tendency to distance oneself from traditional writing and the arts and traditional art forms. It was much more conceptual. There was another tendency called fluxus, which again was a conceptual artistic tendency trying to bypass the commercialization of the art world by putting emphasis on thought processes as inherent parts of the artwork. Now, at the same time, and on the opposite side of the spectrum, what emerged, especially in the United States, was pop art with Andy Warhol and his serializations. And this came also to symbolize a globalized cultural industry. Again, avant-garde, but as part and parcel of a globalized cultural industry. Now, the concept of the underground was also an important element in the post-war period. This was part and parcel of the avant-gardes of the 1950s and 60s, and was directly linked to the writers of the so-called Beat generation in the United States. It was associated with an alternative lifestyle that characterized itself by non-conformity, the participation in what was called counterculture, and in general, a contestation of the established ways of life. Around this idea, the main element there was the fusion between the high culture and low culture, between sophisticated intellectual items and popular consumer products. Now, bringing, again, art and life closer together was the objective of small artistic vanguard groups, often connected to the New Left, like the Situationists in France or the Provosts in the Netherlands in the 1960s, who aimed to restructure and transform everyday life in the modern city. These were groups which produced irreverent posters, subversive poetry, ironic writing, often writing on walls, which were elements which were reproduced by social movements with a utopian project toward the end of the 1960s. And I'm talking, of course, about the mass protests in 1968 in Paris, Berlin, Rome, New York, Berkeley. These were all movements which showcased the dialectic between playfulness and seriousness, engagé political action, and everyday iconoclasm. Now, a last interesting element about the post-Second World War avant-gardes or utopian thinking has to do with communitarianism. Communitarianism, of course, having roots much earlier on, from the late 19th century to also the early 20th century. But there is a new tendency, there is a revival of communitarianism, especially in the 1960s. Communitarianism as a lifestyle choice. And there is a variety and avalanche of communes, hippie communes, rural communes, more politicized communes, for example, the Kommune 1 in West Berlin, again around 68, or even more experimental or artistically transgressive communes, such as the Friedrichshof Kommune, which was founded by Austrian artist Otto Mühl in Vienna. That was an interesting example of this. Now, just to summarize, avant-garde art in the first half of the 20th century often run parallel to the great political revolutions, world conflicts, cultural revolts, fascism, communism. Then during the second half of the 20th century, the neo-avant-garde, it retained a longing for experimental research and for rethinking, decompartmentalizing social and political realities. So hence it lost some of the strictly ideological edge of earliest manifestations, but we still have several examples in especially the late 1960s and around 1968 of a fusion between the personal and the political arts and politics, high and low culture.